This project sort of came to me since we brought Iceland in yesterday or 2 days ago with Becca's talk. This was really a complete full download after I had returned from Iceland in July. And the impact of the green and perhaps the subtle realms really kind of altered some stuff in my mind that I was not prepared to have altered, but felt so safe in kind of running with. So this is kind of the result, the end product of what was a really long journey and a very sort of courageous turn on that journey. This is kind of where I'm focusing now, as opposed to the history of astrology, which will always be dear to me and will always weave its way in through my work. But now I feel like moving forward, but also in moving forward, moving back to the earth. So that's sort of where we are right now. So I wanted to start off with a brief sort of visualization, if everybody wants to close their eyes for just a second. And I wanted us all to imagine we're sitting in the farthest low bath, naked in the waters of Esalen, kind of at that point where you can hang over the edge and sort of look out at the sea. And the sea is lulling softly, the waves are crashing but ever so gently. And there's a flock of birds just ever so slightly out to sea, kind of floating. Some of them are dipping their heads in the water. Some of them are doing that cute little ruffle butt shake with their wings. Some of them are just absorbing the sun, it seems, kind of in a lull. And then I want you to kind of peripherally open up your environment to the sounds that you hear. And you hear a colleague in the background talking about how they're about to catch a flight to home. And the moment that the word flight comes out of your colleague's mouth, the entire flock of birds erupts, leaves the water, takes flight, and heads to the horizon. You guys can open your eyes whenever you're ready. How do we not make meaning of a moment like that? It's kind of what I want to ask. How is there not meaning in such a beautiful synchronicity? So hold that kind of place as we go through this. So this is called the Blanchard bone. It is a prehistoric artifact. It's from about 25 to 35,000 years ago, so it's old. And it's a bone that has these carvings in it. It was found in a cave in France somewhere near Lascaux, where a lot of our sort of prehistoric archaeological evidence comes from. And there's a sort of, I don't know, a story going around in terms of people, professors, archaeologists who study the Blanchard bone, and do my best to kind of recreate it. A woman talks about how she was in her philosophy or her archaeology class, and the professor got up and put the thing up. The professor was a woman, and she said, "This is the Blanchard bone. This is alleged to be man's first attempt at making a calendar." And then the professor continues to say, "What I want to ask is, why would any man need to know 28 days when 28 days have elapsed?" I'm going to suggest, says the professor, that this is woman's first attempt at making a calendar. And so this woman has kind of like erupted a little bubble, and now people are trying to wonder to what extent women had a role in kind of beginning calendrical timekeeping in humanity's sort of early history. I will find the name of the woman who said this, but it's totally gone right now, and I'm not going to waste time thinking about it. So what I'm sort of starting with this for is because I wonder to what extent is simple calendar making a form of divination. To us now who have a very current and clear picture of what we sort of think of as time, and then until you talk to Carrie, who then breaks all that into pieces. We, who think we know what time is, wouldn't look at this and think it's divinatory. But 25 to 35,000 years ago, this may have been a sort of seedling of that sort of divinatory mindset where you're trying to figure out a pattern or an answer when something is going to come, what's going to happen, what the future looks like, in this sort of conglomeration of events and potentially seeming chaos. I had spoken to Elizabeth Allison about this topic, and she had brought up something I never once would have thought of, but like, what about climate models, right? Are climate models divinatory? What about weather forecasting? Is weather forecasting divinatory? And to what extent are all of these things implied as a sort of divinatory method of trying to understand what we don't understand? What I kind of think, what I want to kind of discuss is that divination is itself a methodology. Granted, it is by no means one that is accepted as such, but it's a methodology. It's a way of seeking answers, right, with a set of tools that we don't necessarily have, right, or maybe that we don't understand. And this is in pretty stark contrast to science, which is seeking an answer with tools that we have, that we know how they work, and we understand the concept of how they function. And because of this, I kind of like to think of divination as like a meta science, right? It forces us out of that state of mind where we can say, I know this. And it kind of brings us into a place of, I don't know this, but it's still true. And it forces us to kind of rethink what we believe to be epistemologically real. Ancient people, indigenous cultures, Jungians, they've all had room in their worldview for this sense of divination. And although typically divination is thought of as an answer to a question, right? Seeking an answer to a question. Should I move to France? Does my lover love me? Will I get this house I just put an offer in? That seems to be the box in which we put divination in. I want to kind of suggest that it also is the act of making something divine. It's a verb, right? And we'll kind of go through a little exercise right now to maybe, perhaps, show that. So we start with an idea or an image, Orion. But actually, we don't really start with the image. We kind of start with the chaos, right? The stars, the vastness, the lack of order, the lack of structure. And then from there, we attempt to kind of create an image, or maybe that image is already kind of implied and we're just picking it up. And then from that image, we add story, mythology. We refine what we think we see, and we give it a historical context. We give it a narrative. We give it an identity. And then from there, this is constellation of Orion. And then from there, we can even simplify it further, right? And turn it into a symbol. And this symbol can still carry within it the greatness of that mythological tradition, of the historical context. But now it's like an alphabet. And then we can use that. We can use it, and we can do things with it, like paint it on things, put it on rocks. And now this vastness of the cosmos has become sort of portable and can fit in the palm of our hand. We can carry it around in our pocket. And then if the stone, which has now sort of been imbued with this sort of symbolic kind of divine essence, if this little stone that we can fit in our pocket is divine, well then what of, your kind of real stones, right? Like, then everything holds the potential of carrying that divine sort of wisdom that's been embedded into it through our act of divination, of making it divine. So I kind of like to think of that as what I'm trying to get at with divining ecology. And I also want to suggest that in doing this, we shouldn't be approaching it from too logical a place. We should also, every single one of us, be divining the messages in this talk rather than trying too linearly to understand. So as I started to kind of think about these things, I returned from Iceland, all of this is sort of downloading to me, and I thought to myself, I really want to study divinatory methods and the relationship to ecology. And do people who think of their divinatory methods in stone have a different relationship to the earth than, say, people who think of their divinatory methods in the sky? And so my first thought was, I'm going to study every divination that has ever existed on the entire planet, right? I'm going to the whole globe, and I'm going to try. I had this beautiful vision. And there are people who are very, very wise who suggested that perhaps I couldn't circle the whole globe in the efforts of making one divination dissertation. So, however, I had this great sort of momentary conversation with Leif yesterday, and he pointed out you actually could circle the whole globe if you just did it in a tiny circle at the very top around the North Pole. And so that's what I'm doing. Despite my best protests, I ended up kind of focusing on a very small part of the globe, specifically in one culture that happens to reside in the Arctic Circle. So I was able to take the vastness of what I wanted to create and narrow it down into something potentially manageable, at least for the next couple of years of my life.
Marcia, is that, or Laura, is that Iceland?
This is Norway. So yeah, and my work is not specific. I'll introduce it right now. But this is a rock in Norway. It's called Bolten. And again, I can thank Leif for the pronunciation and that, but it's supposed to be like the most dangerous rock, and a bunch of kids go there and try and stand on it, and people die and stuff, but it's also really profound. And I mean, it's huge. It's not, this is above a fjord. The massiveness of this is dwarfed in this photo. So the Arctic Circle, not only is it a sensible 4% of the Earth's sort of land mass, 11,000 mile ring around the top of the Earth, so it's somewhat manageable. But it also has this really great characteristic of being it's being kind of at the front line, right, of where we are right now towards the future. It is the most affected by climate change right now. But then it also has potentially one of the longest sort of lineages dating back to the Ice Age. And so there's cultural continuity that exists in the sort of vastness and the harsh conditions of the Arctic that really made it a great place to kind of study this, because it really is the confluence of both the past and as well as the future. And then we can also kind of look at what's bubbling up in it right now. So the Arctic was very useful for me. And then when I was looking into Arctic divination, I found the Sami people. And the Sami are basically the inhabitants of Lapland. So they span 3 countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and then a little bit into the Kora or Karelian Peninsula of Russia. So they really kind of live in this area. And some scholars believe that there's no reason to assume that their cultural continuity has been at all interrupted, really, except for in the last few hundred years with Christianity. So the Sami we'll go into them a little bit more, but initially I just want to kind of start with their divination system. And the Sami drum is this beautiful drum. There's only about 72 left in the world that at least are from a historical sort of traditional standpoint, because all the other ones were burned, in some cases along with the shamans who had made them and used them. But now there's a resurgence, so people are starting to make them themselves or have hidden them away, protected them, so that they wouldn't suffer the same fate as many people did in like the 1700s. So the Sami drum functions as a drum, so you can play music with it. It also functions as a map. A lot of the tradition has been lost in relationship to all of the colonization and Christianization, but what we kind of know is that it was most likely a star map. One scholar seems to think that they even might have been star charts. The way that they're laid out is very, very similar in the quadrature sort of formation to what we would look at as a Western star chart. But we do know that some of the shamans would say things like, I can't get home without my drum, you can't take my drum. And so there's a sense that it was both a map of the sky as well as the terrain, and even definitely of the sort of subtle realms in which they could kind of function. And the drum was used as a divinatory method. If you see in the top right or mid-right, there's a little ring. And so they would take the ring, set it on top. They could also use like a collection of reindeer bones or teeth. The reindeer herders up there, we'll get to that soon too. And they would put the tool on it, and they would beat the drum. And in their beating of the drum, the little objects would move across the top of it. And that would be how they could divine their answer based on the interpretation of where the things would lie. This is just a good picture. I just want to show like how beautiful they are. unanimously, anthropologists agree that the center is always the sun. And I can't go into it now, but I just want to point out that it's almost always square and quadrature in nature, which I think is really important when we think of the Sami and seasons, because they are absolutely in the Arctic 100% dependent upon knowing the seasons and being able to kind of navigate them. And then this is an image of a contemporary one. So you can kind of see that it's not lost, and that there's even some sort of modern implements, like a little silver ring that we see wasn't there in the ones of a couple hundred years ago. So I wanted to show a couple images of the people, of the Sami people, but not just of the Sami people, of diviners kind of in general. And I want to sort of remind everybody that diviners have pretty much guaranteed, historically, lived a very dangerous life. They are often the first that are persecuted, even in the sort of high cultures of like ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia, where they were a respected part of, say, the clergy or the political sphere. They still lived kind of on the outskirts. They were not a natural embedded part of the average kind of community. And so as a result of that, there's this sense of invisibility in their identity. And I'm going to kind of set this slideshow going, and there's going to be images popping up of different people from different cultures. And although it seems in one way absolutely gratuitous to just kind of like, ooh, look at the other, I think that there's a real healing potential in seeing these people who the world has tried so many times to make unseen, to make invisible. And so I invite you, as I'm talking, to really kind of look at them, because so many times their cultures have tried to be erased, their languages have been lost, their identity has been questioned as worthy of existing at all. And so enjoy. It should be going on its own. So diviners have often been nomads, or nomads have been diviners. There's a lot that we can kind of bring into that conversation that you know is definitely a topic for another time. But the Bedouin of the Middle East have divination systems that are pre-Islamic and go back to sort of Zoroastrian and Persian traditions. The Roma, gypsies, are known as fortune tellers. That's one of the things that they have come to be archetypally connected with. And then the Sami themselves, as well as Siberian shamans and other inhabitants of the taiga and the tundra in Mongolia. And even if we look in the history of astrology, where I've done so much work, the astrologers that survived and that were able to kind of carry the lineage through, they were always on the move. They would get exiled, they would make enemies, they had to continually move to places where it was safe to be who they were. And so there is this sense of constantly having to be on the move in order to protect yourself and your art. And I think that what's interesting is that even though historically we've seen sort of the tendency towards prosecution, even death, nowadays we see more like a sense of exile, periphery living, a huge problem with environmental racism, which we're getting a chance to really see played out with Standing Rock right now. But you know, the Roma often live in encampments that are in wasteland, more or less. And so to kind of know that this is all still going on today, right now. And I want to say and suggest, too, that the fate of the diviner is somehow kind of related right to the fate of the planet. And that we can kind of see that the planet, just as diviners, has been really kind of prosecuted. It's been invisible, it's been ignored, abused, taken advantage of. And so there's a really kind of possible parallel between those two things, and that's also one of the things that I really wanted to kind of draw out is that when we persecute one, we end up persecuting the other. And so is there something more to that particular thought or conversation? And I'm going a little bit faster than my slides, so I'm going to actually just give us 1 second to kind of enjoy these before I start the next moment. These are encampments in the Arctic. I think this one is the Nenets people, so they're more Mongolia, Siberia borders. The next slide will be a picture of the Sami people. And the Sami have been very much idealized and kind of like mythologized. There's a lot of misinterpretation of them. Now, as they're sort of resurging and starting to claim their own identity, they really want to be able to kind of tell us who they are instead of being told who they are, the way that has been for many years. There's only one more image after this. If any of you find yourself attracted to the Sami people, Erica Larson is a great resource. She was a National Geographic photographer and journalist, and she's done incredible work. That photo is from her. So picking back up with Arctic or sort of the environmental connection and suppression of the environment, suppression of the diviners, and then looking at environmental hazards that are really kind of present in the Arctic right now, which is facing a vast majority of major issues. We have unprecedented deforestation. This is an image of the Amazon, but I wanted to show it. This is in Sweden. We have mining happening, really just dominating landscapes that have been untouched since the last ice age. More images of deforestation. This is also South America. This is the Arctic again. I think this is a mine in Finland. Or actually, this is Canada. This is a diamond mine in Canada. And then oil extraction in Finland. So these are all very real threats that our lifestyles are absolutely accommodating. But then additionally, they also have a whole other set of very real environmental hazards with climate change, glacial melt, snowpack, which are critical when you're doing things like herding reindeers across thousands of miles. So just to kind of keep that in mind. Now, going kind of a little bit further into divinatory methods and how they relate to the environment. These are runes. They're made of rocks. There's lots of rocks in Scandinavia. Kind of straightforward. This is a Ifa divination. In Africa, they use cowrie shells. So there tends to be obviously a very clear connection between the simple natural objects that you can go out and collect out your front door, and then being able to kind of imbue that with the divine and use it to answer questions. This is another type of Ifa set. I can't remember the name of the bead right now, but it's like a seed. West Africa, Ifa is a very wonderful divination system. One of the ones that I would love to included. And they will come in peripherally. And then what I think is even interesting, especially in this image, which is of Kenko, which is a site in the Sacred Valley in Peru. And they've literally turned, this is huge. This image is probably a giant piece of rock this big, and it's a divinatory method. They would slaughter an animal, sacrifice an animal, and the blood would pour down one side or the other, and that would give them an answer to their question. So sometimes you're even using the actual landscape as your divination. And then this is a tortoise shell from old China. And the reindeer, my favorite. The interesting thing about this is that there have been, divination is not always necessarily a good thing for the environment. In the case of the turtle shell, there were periods of time where diviners were so overzealously trying to, make money and get people to sort of be their customers that they actually almost made extinct a population of tortoise in order to get these turtle shells to sketch their images on to do divination with. So it's not always a good thing. There's this weird relationship between the two, but I would say more often than not, and what I'm going to get to at some point in the next 4 minutes here, is that the diviners are stewards of the environment. They use it and they respect it, and they want to make sure they have it to continue using it. So like I was saying, the Sami are reindeer herders, and there's an entire ecological component to this as well, in that, number one, obviously the relationship with the animals themselves, but then also there's a sense of knowing the landscape, not just from a human perspective, what can it provide me, but from a broader perspective of what can it provide all of the living creatures that exist within this vast environment. Hold on. As a result of this, they have to be kind of hyper aware of their seasons, right? And also, I think in the Sami language, there's something like over 100 words for snow, because the snow has so many different ideations and they have to know that. And additionally, herding itself is an act of ecological sustainability, because if you let the reindeer, theoretically, right, we don't really know, and this would be a great topic, but theoretically, if you let the reindeer do what they do, they could overgraze, and they could end up in lands that are not mature enough. And so the herders themselves are making sure that each forest has sufficient time to regenerate before the reindeer herd comes through and eats the moss out of it. And so there's this really wonderful kind of deep, profound connection to the environment that just herding itself has to kind of imbue or contain. I already talked about overuse of divination. So we started a little late, right? I have still a little bit of time. Okay. So I want to kind of go in now to just sacred landscapes in general. And what I thought was so interesting about Becca's talk is that she pointed to the weird stone structures, that those were what really tipped it off, the thing you kind of saw before. And I guess I didn't know this, but they're called elf houses, and I think, or elf churches, and that is so wonderful to me. But all over Scandinavia, and of course in other parts of the world, the Sami call them seda. They're religious sites that are just sacred landscapes, and this is where they go to kind of pray. Sometimes it can take the form of just a sort of odd geological rock or something, or as we'll see in the next image, an actual whole mountain. This is Spakkonuful, which is the prophecy mountain, and this is in northern Iceland, and the story is that the first inhabitant of this little town was a prophet, and she ascended this mountain and got her sort of messages. So Iceland also does have a wonderful sort of tradition of divination which comes across through the magic and the Eddas. So in addition to sacred landscapes, hold on, I have to follow my notes. So then it's obviously not relegated, right, to one part of the world. You have these really profound sacred landscapes kind of all over the place. I really want this to change. Uluru in Australia is an incredibly sacred monument. And then, Machu Picchu, the whole Sacred Valley. And then I also want to kind of remind us that divination is, in one way, is a kind of moment that we engage with in material to get an answer, but prophecy itself is also kind of contained in that. And so divination exists equally as profoundly in kind of the founding religions. And so at some point soon we'll see some images of Mecca, of the Kaaba, big black stone, and of the burning bush, which was a message, but still was contained within ecology, within a tree, that there's some sort of richness, that the divine can speak to us in any way. Let's just kind of look at these for a moment before I get into the next section. I'll slightly narrate. These are prehistoric stone structures on the island of Sardinia in Italy. They have a very rich, witchy, divinatory sort of tradition there. This is presumably Moses' burning bush. And then if we even think about the fact that Muhammad was a prophet, like the original kind of diviner. That's Mount Sinai. And then the Kaaba. I'm so sorry, does anybody have any questions while I'm in this, before I do the closing set of images, while this is running behind me? It's okay if you don't, you can just gaze.
Yeah, what you wanted to compare this with divining from the sky. Do you have any initial hypotheses?
I really wanted it to be clear, and it's not. I really wanted to be able to say, the Western tradition has, invariably divined through the stars, and this, and now we're doing technology and blah. But it's so not clear. Delphi, another oracle built in the environment, and also responsive to the environment. There's that sort of theory that there was natural gases in the site that gave the priestesses their high. And then this is the image that I kind of want to pick up again with. So this picture was taken by that woman, Erica Larson. And in the background, those are reindeer. So now the landscape has become animated, right? Now it's not just a geological feature that sits and doesn't go anywhere. Now it's a geological feature that is alive and that is cell-like. And this is the Sami shaman currently, I'm going to call him that. I don't think he would call himself a Nuadi or a shaman in Sami. He's a reindeer herder, but this is his vantage point overseeing the entire sort of area where his reindeer are currently grazing. And so there's this wonderful sort of idea of when we kind of take back the environment and engage with it, it becomes a living thing again. Or we can see it living because it's already alive, right? So then this brings me kind of to the last couple set of images, and that is that perhaps the diviner, we think of it as shaman now, but and through my work I'm really going to try and tease out the difference between a diviner and a shaman, even though it would be fluid at best and more contextual than actually essential. There's definitely a difference that exists. But I want to kind of say that we're stewards, right? And if I think of looking at the sky at night at Esalen, and of course I think of astrology in some ways and in some uses as a divination system, I think of our knowledge of what we see in the cosmos and how we can find a constellation and tell a story about it. And I imagine 100 years from now with just the space litter of satellites and how we're going to be able to kind of remember and contain the original sort of sanctity of the cosmos well beyond anything that the universe or technology or a movement forward for progress can kind of cover it up with. And so in many ways the diviner is very much a steward, a maintainer, somebody who has to kind of continue to keep everything aligned, not only for the sake of people and culture and happiness and well-being and spiritual oneness, transcendence, this image, but also for the safety of the earth and for the sustainable kind of future of humanity. One thing I didn't say that I want to kind of put in here real quick too is specifically in the Sami tradition, as a result of their sort of persecution, or let's say in spite of their persecution, there was a couple of hundred years, say the 1600s to like the early 1800s, where they were kind of wiped clean and then Christianized. And as a result of that, in spite of that, the landscape still was able to hold Sami names. So the mountain ranges and specific rocks and such, even to Norwegian or Swedish or Finnish people, they still hold the Sami name. And I wanted to kind of point out that despite cultural risk and sort of devastation, the landscape can kind of hold that tradition. It's still there. They could never fully eradicate them because they left it in the mountains and in the trees. And then to think moving forward, as we look at now the problems in the Arctic specifically, but everywhere, as the environment is starting to become at risk, you see a resurgence of Sami culture and of the culture kind of coming in to say, I'm going to carry the earth while the earth carried us when we were being persecuted. And we're not going to lose one or the other, and that there's this reciprocal relationship between the two of landscape to kind of contain identity, and of identity then to kind of remember landscape or cosmic scape. That's the last image. I wanted to end on a female shaman for selfish reasons. That's it. Any questions? Jeremy, do we have the requirement of a microphone? Is that how we're doing this? Or you? Okay.
I don't.
Okay.
Do you make any distinguishment between omen reading and divination?
I mean, obviously, you have to, but for the purposes of a not nearly long enough talk, I'm lumping it all in. But yeah, I mean, for me, there's an entire way of looking at divination as it's, what I'm calling sort of like the ecology of divination, and like the different landscapes in which divinatory methods can exist. Do I think there's anything different? Of course. The difference between something that you manipulate to get an answer between something that already exists, right? An omen would be something you didn't have control of, whereas a casting of the runes is something you did have control of. But my assumption and my personal experience as a practitioner of both, right, is that it's the same thing underneath and behind. And however you decide, like one could wonder if we think historically, traditionally speaking, the reason someone would cast a rune or a tarot reading would be because someone asked them to do it, right? Hey, I need an answer. You're a diviner. Cast the runes and tell me my future. And so in some ways, even though the diviner is physically casting the rune invited them to it through the other person who was asking them for a reading. And so I don't know. There may not be an actual difference. I think there is, obviously, but I wonder, you know, to what extent, if we're kind of looking at this sort of tradition that's living and breathing behind everything, if having your guest kind of come in and ask you to do a reading for them is just the same as seeing a green flash of the sun.